As we continue with our opening ceremony, we would like to recognize our final keynote speaker of this opening ceremony, Gail Smith, who is the president and CEO of the One Campaign, and before that was the former administrator of USAID and also an advisor to President Obama as the senior director for development and democracy at the U.S. National Security Council. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Hi. Thanks for having me here this morning, and I'm going to make a couple of assumptions at the beginning. I was introduced appropriately and correctly as the president and CEO of the One Campaign. We're an organization that doesn't run programs. We run campaigns. Think of a political campaign without a politician, right? We mobilize people basically to try to get governments and decision makers to do the things that we think they ought to do. Engage more seriously with Africa, invest more resources behind that vision. And I'm going to assume for the purposes of my remarks that everybody in this room is a little bit of an activist and an advocate, or we wouldn't be here together this morning. The second is, with these words, stronger and most importantly valuable, as part of the descriptor for this event, I'm going to assume we all agree on something else that is fundamental, that as was referred by an earlier speaker, we're at a period of change. And I think this is one where Africa is not an object in the world, but Africa is a key player on the global stage. And so what does that mean, and how do we actually seize that opportunity? And I think the previous speaker spoke to some of that. But if you consider a market that is now 1.2 billion consumers, if you consider that with the Continental Free Trade Area that came into force recently in Africa, that's the largest free trade area on the planet after the World Trade Organization. So we're talking about a huge economic player. I would argue we're talking about a huge political player, and I think many of these things aren't as well recognized as they should be. One of the really powerful trends is Africa voting increasingly as a bloc. You heard reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. Africa was the only region that came into those negotiations with a common position agreed by every head of state. That meant that Africa's weight in international organizations is much heavier than it once was and much more strategically placed. We hear a lot about the burgeoning, growing youth population in Africa. While that may be a challenge in terms of the demand for jobs, it's also a huge opportunity, especially when one considers that it's 14 kilometers from a very important region in this world, but one that has an aging population. There's a huge opportunity there. I think as well on innovation, I just came back from a trip to Africa. There were a couple of years, 180 innovation hubs across the continent. Today, by best estimates, there's 655. This is a continent which I've always been pleased to say, where I come from, which is Washington, D.C., that had mobile money before we had it in the capital of the United States. This is a continent that I think has the potential to leapfrog some of the biggest challenges the rest of us have faced. If you think about energy, in my country, we are totally dependent on a national grid, and if something happens, we are all in trouble. Africa's leapfrogging to composite grids, where you've got big grids, mini grids, off grids, a distribution of energy which is much more reliable and much safer in terms of dependence. We've heard a lot about education. Think of the leapfrogging that can be done in education, and I share the support for education being a theme here. But again, there's the opportunity to say what has gone wrong with education elsewhere, how does Africa build out an education system that not just puts kids in school and gets people through secondary school and into the training that is needed for the future economies of that continent, but which also builds on what some of the rest of us have learned and leaps over the problems we've created. So I think it's a moment of extraordinary opportunity, extraordinary potential leadership. I'm not discounting the problems that the continent faces, but frankly, in my lifetime and career, I think we spend enough time admiring the problems, and now is the time to really focus on the future, again, of Africa as an extraordinary player on the global stage. The challenge is, how do we actually do that? And what do we need to think about as those who are committed to seeing that stronger and valuable realized in the eyes of everyone in the world? The first thing I'd propose is that we think about changing the time frame. I think if you think about Africa and the Commonwealth, Africa and the United Nations, Africa and the United States, Africa and the world economy, if we think about the next 5 years, you get one picture. Think about the next 30 or 40 years, and it's a very different picture. One of the things we're working on, for example, is what is a vision of a new partnership between Europe and Africa? The creation of that vision will be led by what we call our youth ambassadors and one champions. These are young leaders who, by definition, are thinking about the next 30 or 40 years. And their vision of what that partnership looks like, if you think about where the global economy is going over the next 40 years, is a very different one than if we just think about the next 5 years. I think the second thing is, as we think about development, how do we think about sustainability and inclusion? What we think about at the One campaign, now we campaign a lot, for example, in this country to make sure that the UK remains committed to a robust aid level to 0.7, and that the quality of that aid is significant. But we also campaign for governments to invest more of their resources in developing countries into development, and for flows of private capital that will allow economies to be more self-reliant. The key on that is inclusion. How do you do that in such a way that everybody benefits? Huge challenges there. I will give you a statistic on something we're focused on. At the rate the world is going today, it will take 99.5 years for the world to reach gender equality. How many women and men in this room think it's a really good idea to wait 100 years? Right? So development is also about that inclusion that leads to the equality that translates into economic benefit, cutting away to extreme poverty. So we campaign for aid, we campaign for the other resources. Remember that when the SDGs were agreed upon, there was another agreement made there, that for development to work, it needed to be financed by 3 streams of capital: overseas development assistance, domestic resources, and private capital. We also campaign, though, for ODA for the reason that there are some countries making extraordinary progress. There are some countries where people are unfortunate to have been, I think in our view, burdened twice. They may face extreme poverty, but they also face poor governments. And I think there's a need, we believe, for us to act in solidarity with those kids, those men and women who have the same aspirations we all share. So again, we've got to focus on the most vulnerable, as well as those who are in countries that are doing better. I think the other big thing in thinking about how do we think about sustainability and inclusion, and I know that many of the attendees at this summit are from the business community, and some of you are investors yourselves, is countering the perception of risk. I know that when I talk to people about investing in Africa, oftentimes, they assume there's a huge risk. The perception of risk is greater than the actual risk. It is actually a very good investment. But I think all of us need to do more to counter that perception by demonstrating examples and providing data. And it's one thing that I think this community can do a terrific job of. The best way to counter perceptions that are misplaced is to give people facts and evidence. And we think that that's one of the things that makes a huge difference. The third thing that's critical, sorry, I just destroyed the podium, critical for all of us is an engaged citizenry. And what does that mean? You all are an engaged citizenry because you're here today. We believe that unless citizens are actively engaged, you don't have accountability. And that's not just true in Africa or the Commonwealth, it's true in every country in the world. So if you think about the CFTA, for example, if citizens are engaged and understand how that works, they will not only hold governments accountable, but it will be more effective. We've worked on this issue, let me give you an example from Nigeria, where we're very proud to have a really extraordinary one team that has run a campaign in now 2 rounds called Make Niger Stronger. The campaign there is aimed to press the government to invest more in primary health care. With partners across Nigeria, they banded together, they spoke to the Senate, they've talked to the media, they did public demonstrations, they brought in artists and entertainers to make the case that President Buhari should invest over and above the budget in primary health care. The exciting thing is they won. And the president signed up for increasing expenditure on primary health care. They are now campaigning to make sure that those resources actually go to primary health care in the areas where they are intended to go. And what starts to happen when you see that? We run something called one vote campaigns in different countries when there's an election. We try to get to the candidates and say, if you're elected, what will you do? What will you do for Africa and the Commonwealth? What will you do in terms of British aid to Africa? What will you do in terms of trade and investment? We try to get them to sign up before they're elected so that when they're elected, we can say, you promised to do this, tell us what you're going to do. We organized our first one in Nigeria. These are big in Europe and in the United States. Our first one vote campaign called Vote Your Future in Nigeria attracted 3,500 people to the first meeting. That's bigger than any similar campaign that we've ever run. And I think the message there is that people want to be engaged, and the more we engage them, the better returns we get. We've just worked in Senegal with NGOs there to get agreement on a stronger law on rape as a criminal offense. The important thing here is that this is not me or us going in and saying this is what should happen. This is us working with Senegalese, with Nigerians, to engage a citizenry, to improve the well-being of citizens everywhere. So what I'd like to ask all of you as you go through a couple, I'm sure, very exciting days of building progress and a plan and agenda for where you hope to see Africa and the Commonwealth go, is where possible and where you have interest to join with us. We are campaigning for a number of things here in the UK. There are a number of opportunities of things where I think together we can encourage governments to take decisions that reinforce that notion of stronger and valuable. We've got colleagues here today from one. We are happy to reach out to you. It's my hope that together we can ensure that stronger and valuable are realized not just in the eyes of the continent or in the eyes of the Commonwealth, but indeed of everyone here today and everyone on the planet. So with that, I'd like to thank you and wish you best of luck for your deliberations. Thank you for having us, and I hope we can work together. Thank you very much.